It was a Tuesday morning that started like any other in the city of Crestwood, with the sun struggling to burn through a low layer of gray clouds that hung over the skyline like a held breath. For most people, it was just another day of traffic and coffee and the quiet grind of getting through the week. But for Ethan Cole, it was the day everything in his carefully ordered life was about to shatter, and he had no idea it was coming. He was standing in the middle of a construction site that sprawled across half a city block, the skeletal frame of what would soon be the Sterling Tower rising above him like a monument to ambition. The building was supposed to be the crown jewel of the city's new downtown revival, a 60-story glass and steel testament to progress, and it was Ethan's job to make sure it was safe. He was the independent structural inspector brought in at the final stage, the last pair of eyes before the ribbon was cut and the tenants moved in. And on that Tuesday, he was holding a report that made his stomach churn with a dread he hadn't felt in years. The report detailed a series of anomalies in the concrete mix used on the 42nd floor, variations in density that weren't supposed to exist in a building of this caliber. The numbers were subtle, the kind of discrepancies that could be easily explained away by a tired engineer or a rushed quality control officer. But Ethan had been doing this job for nearly 2 decades, and he had learned to trust his gut over the neat summaries on a spreadsheet. He had walked that floor himself, tapping the columns, feeling the vibration under his boots, and the difference was palpable, a hollow echo where there should have been solid mass. It was the kind of thing that wouldn't cause a collapse today, or even tomorrow, but given enough time, and enough stress, it would become a weak point, a fracture waiting for the right pressure to turn into a catastrophe. He was still staring at the numbers when his phone buzzed in his pocket, the screen lighting up with the name of the man who had the most to lose if that report ever saw the light of day. Julian Sterling was a developer who had built his empire on a philosophy of relentless forward momentum. He was the kind of man who saw delays as a personal insult and questioned the competence of anyone who couldn't keep up with his pace. He didn't walk into a room so much as he occupied it, his presence filling every corner with a palpable sense of urgency. When Ethan walked into the penthouse suite that served as the project's temporary command center, Julian was surrounded by his team, a collection of lawyers, architects, and project managers who all seemed to be holding their breath. The room was all gleaming surfaces and expensive furniture, a stark contrast to the dusty, raw concrete of the construction site. Julian barely looked up from the tablet he was scrolling through as Ethan entered, his dismissal clear before a single word was spoken. Ethan placed the report on the polished table in the center of the room, a simple manila folder that seemed out of place amidst the sleek technology. He explained his findings calmly, pointing out the specific test results and the potential implications for the building's long-term integrity. He wasn't trying to be alarmist. He was just stating the facts as he had found them. He suggested a series of core samples and load tests on the 42nd floor, a procedure that would take about a week and cost a significant amount of money, but was the only way to definitively determine the extent of the problem. The silence that followed his words was heavy with unspoken tension. Julian finally looked up from his tablet, his eyes narrowing as he processed the interruption. The developer's response was a masterclass in condescension. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke in a calm, measured tone that was far more cutting than any shout could ever be. He pointed out that his own team of engineers, experts, who had been with the project from the beginning, had already signed off on every single floor. He questioned how an outside contractor, a man who had been hired for a simple final stamp of approval, could possibly have found something that everyone else had missed. He leaned back in his chair, a dismissive smirk playing on his lips, and told Ethan that he had been paid a considerable sum for this inspection, a sum that was now looking like a waste of money. He implied that Ethan was either incompetent or, worse, trying to manufacture a problem to inflate his fee. The room, full of people who owed their livelihoods to Julian Sterling, remained silent, their eyes averted. Ethan stood his ground, his own voice quiet but firm, reiterating that the data was irrefutable, and that the building's safety was not a matter of opinion. It was at that moment that the humiliation began in earnest. Julian stood up, walking around the table to stand directly in front of Ethan. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, and he used his physical presence as another weapon. He spoke about Ethan's personal life, something he had clearly had his people investigate. He mentioned Ethan's ex-wife, who had left him years ago, and his daughter, Lily, a bright, quiet 12-year-old who lived with him. He painted a picture of a struggling single father, desperate for money, trying to leverage a non-existent problem to squeeze a few extra dollars out of a successful businessman. He didn't just question Ethan's professional integrity. He tore apart his personal life, using the most painful details as ammunition. He said it was pathetic that a man so obviously burdened by his own failures would try to drag down a project that meant so much to the city. He laughed, a short, cruel sound that echoed in the sterile room, and said that Ethan was clearly out of his depth, a small-town inspector trying to play in the big leagues. He told him to take his report and leave, that he would have his own lawyers review it and decide if any further action was necessary, but that Ethan should not expect to be paid for his trouble. Ethan felt the heat rise to his face, a burning shame that had nothing to do with being proven wrong and everything to do with his life being laid bare and mocked. He thought of Lily, who had spent the night before struggling with a fever, and how he had to leave her with a neighbor just to make it to this meeting. The money wasn't for a new car or a vacation. It was for a specialist's appointment she desperately needed, an expense his insurance barely covered. He had told no one about this, preferring to shoulder the burden alone. But Julian Sterling had seen it all written on his face, and now he was using it to destroy him. Ethan stood there, the folder in his hands, feeling the weight of everyone's judgmental stares. He didn't deserve this. He had done his job, and he had done it honestly. He looked around the room at the lawyers, who were already starting to pack up their things, and he understood that the verdict had been delivered. He was a nobody, a broken man, and his opinion meant nothing. He knew he should argue, should fight back, but the words wouldn't come. He just turned and walked out, the sound of his boots on the marble floor echoing his defeat. He walked for blocks, not caring where he was going, the folder clutched to his chest like a shield. The construction site faded behind him, replaced by the familiar streets of the older part of town where he lived. He passed the small diner where he and Lily had breakfast every Saturday, the park where he taught her how to ride her bike. All of it felt tainted now, as if the humiliation from that penthouse had seeped into every corner of his world. When he finally arrived home, he paused at the door, trying to compose himself. He couldn't let Lily see him like this. He took a deep breath and forced a smile as he pushed the door open. The apartment was small, cluttered with school books and art supplies, but it was theirs. Lily was curled up on the old couch, still in her pajamas, her face pale and flushed with fever. She gave him a weak smile. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice raspy. "Did you get the job?" He nodded, the lump in his throat making it hard to speak. He sat down beside her, brushing her hair from her forehead. It was hot and clammy. "Yeah, honey," he said softly. "Everything went fine." She was too sick to notice the lie. She just leaned her head against his shoulder, her small hand resting on his arm. "I had a dream last night," she murmured. "We were at the beach. The water was so blue." He closed his eyes, holding her tight, the sting of his failure burning behind his eyelids. Julian Sterling had called him a desperate man trying to make a few extra dollars. He had no idea how desperate. The bill for the specialist was already past due, the cancellation notices from the bank were piling up, and now his only hope of paying them had just been cruelly ripped away. He looked around the apartment, at the cracked window he couldn't afford to fix, the worn-out carpet, the collection of half-empty medicine bottles on the coffee table, and a sense of despair washed over him. He had lost his wife to the pressure of their poverty, and now he was about to lose his daughter because he couldn't afford to get her well. He had been given a choice that morning: walk away from a dangerous truth and get paid, or stand up for what was right and watch his daughter suffer. He had chosen his integrity, and it had cost him everything. Later that evening, after Lily had fallen asleep, her breathing shallow and labored, he sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the report he had almost thrown away. The words seemed to mock him. He traced the numbers with his finger, the discrepancies that had caused him so much trouble. He thought about the call he had just made to the neighbor to cover another day of care, the shame in his voice. He thought about the look on Lily's face when he had walked in the door, the absolute trust she had in him. He was supposed to protect her, to build a safe world for her, and he had failed. He pulled out his phone, his finger hovering over the contact number for Julian Sterling. One call. One admission that he might have been mistaken. A simple retraction, and the money would be released. It was the easiest thing in the world. He could go to the specialist the next day. Lily wouldn't have to suffer through another night of coughing. The thought was intoxicating, a seductive whisper that told him just this once, it didn't matter. He could save her, and no one would ever know the difference. But as his thumb touched the screen, he looked over at the picture of Lily on the wall, a photo of her laughing in the park, and a wave of disgust washed over him. He wasn't a fraud. He was a father who had made a promise to his daughter that he would always be honest, even when it was hard. He couldn't buy her health with someone else's blood. He couldn't save her life by gambling with the lives of hundreds of others who would one day step into that building. It would be a betrayal worse than any failure. He threw his phone across the room, the plastic casing cracking against the wall. The choice was clear, and it was crushing. He would not call. He would not bend. He would find another way, even if it meant the end of everything he had left. The next morning, Ethan was driving Lily to a free clinic on the other side of town, a place with a 3-week waiting list, but it was the only thing he could afford. The guilt was a physical weight in his chest. As he sat in the waiting room, surrounded by other families equally as desperate, his phone buzzed. It was an email from Julian Sterling's legal team. It was a brief, cold letter informing him that his services were no longer required, that his contract was being terminated for gross incompetence, and that he would not be paid for the work he had completed. It was the final nail in the coffin. The email went on to state that Sterling's own engineers had conducted a thorough review of the data and had determined the report was fundamentally flawed. It ended with a veiled threat about the damage of making false claims against a major developer, a hint of a lawsuit that would bury Ethan for good. He was utterly, completely defeated. He sat there for a long moment, the world blurring around him. Lily was in the next room, suffering for lack of care, and the man who was the architect of her suffering was now actively trying to destroy the only thing Ethan had left, his professional reputation. It was the ultimate humiliation. It wasn't enough to rob him of his livelihood. Julian Sterling wanted to make sure he could never work again, to ensure his silence by making him irrelevant. The shock of it was so profound that it numbed him. He looked around the sterile, impersonal clinic, at the fluorescent lights that seemed to drain the color from everything, and he felt the last shred of his hope evaporate. He had been a man of principle, and he had been crushed for it. There was nothing left to do but go home and wait for the inevitable fall. But that evening, a strange thing happened. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer it, expecting another blow from Sterling's camp. But there was something in the tone of the message, a single sentence, that made him pause. "I know what they did," it said. He stared at the words, his heart pounding. He replied, asking who they were. The response came back quickly. It said, "The concrete on 42. It's not a flaw. It's a cover-up." The message came from a man named Ben, a former project manager who had been fired from Sterling's construction company months ago. He claimed to have been involved in the initial phases of the project and had suspected that the concrete supplier was cutting corners. He had tried to raise the issue internally and was silenced. He had been forced out, his career destroyed. He said he had been following the project from afar, waiting for a chance to expose the truth, and when he heard through the grapevine that an inspector had found the same thing he had, he knew it was his only chance. Ethan met Ben at a diner late that night, a greasy spoon far from the glittering towers of the city center. Ben was a nervous, twitchy man, his eyes darting around as if he expected to be ambushed at any moment. He had a thick file of documents, internal emails, shipping manifests, and quality control reports that painted a damning picture. He explained that Sterling, in his quest to meet an impossible deadline, had pressured the concrete supplier to provide a cheaper, weaker mix for the upper floors. The supplier had complied, creating a paper trail that was meant to look like a normal, approved variation. But Ben had kept copies of the real tests, the ones that showed the concrete's strength was far below the building code requirements. It wasn't an accident, it was fraud. Ethan listened, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't just about incompetence, it was about willful, criminal negligence. The humiliation he had suffered at Julian Sterling's hands was just the final act of a much larger, more sinister play. He thought of Lily, how her life was being sacrificed for a billionaire's ego and profit margin. He felt the cold rage begin to build, replacing the despair. He wasn't just a victim, he was a witness. He held the evidence that could bring down a tyrant. But the question was, what could he do with it? He was a nobody, and Sterling had a legion of lawyers. The evidence was in a greasy diner, held by a disgraced former employee. They would be laughed out of any court. They needed more. They needed something irrefutable, something that couldn't be hidden or spun. They needed the physical proof. The next few days were a blur of frantic planning. Lily's fever had broken, but she was still weak, her cough lingering. He had to rely on the neighbor more, feeling the debt of her kindness grow. He couldn't tell anyone what he was doing. If Julian Sterling found out, he wouldn't just destroy Ethan's life, he would put Lily in danger. Ethan and Ben decided that the only way to get the definitive proof was to get a sample of the concrete from the 42nd floor itself and have it tested at an independent lab. It was a risk of monumental proportions. The building was a fortress, crawling with security. But Ben had an old key card from his employment days that he had never turned in. He wasn't sure if it would still work, but it was their only shot. The night they planned to do it was a moonless one. Ethan dropped Lily off at the neighbor's house, telling her he had to go back to work. He saw the disappointment in her eyes, but she didn't complain. She just gave him a kiss on the cheek and told him to be careful. The words hit him like a physical blow. He promised himself that no matter what happened, he would make this right for her. He drove to the construction site, his heart hammering against his ribs. He met Ben at a side entrance, the man's face pale and sweaty in the dim glow of a distant street lamp. The key card worked, the lock clicking open with a soft buzz that seemed deafeningly loud in the silent night. They moved through the dark skeletal structure, the only light coming from the distant glow of the city skyline filtering through the unglassed windows. The place was a labyrinth of steel beams and concrete pillars, a monument to greed that was about to come crashing down. They took the service elevator to the 42nd floor. The doors opened onto a vast, empty space. There was no drywall, no flooring, just the raw skeleton of the building. Ethan took out a heavy-duty drill with a core bit. He found a support column in a secluded area, a place unlikely to be noticed. The sound of the drill, even at its lowest speed, seemed impossibly loud in the silence. He worked quickly, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through him. A cylindrical core of concrete came out, a solid piece of evidence. He placed it in a padded case, his hand shaking. Ben was watching the hallway, his breath held. They had it. They had the proof. But just as Ethan was packing up the drill, they heard the sound of footsteps echoing from the stairwell. The sound was distinct, a heavy tread that grew louder with each passing second. They exchanged a terrified look. The security guard was making his rounds. They were trapped. Ethan grabbed the case and ducked behind a large ventilation duct. Ben scrambled to a different corner. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the beam of a flashlight sweeping the darkness. The guard passed within feet of their hiding spot, his light skimming across the floor. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat, a frantic drumbeat in his ears. He clutched the concrete core to his chest as if it were a fragile bird. The guard paused, shining his light at the column that had been drilled. For a horrifying moment, Ethan was sure he had been seen. But the guard, perhaps just tired and looking for a quiet place to sit, just grunted and moved on. The footsteps faded as he took the stairs to the next floor. They waited for what felt like hours, their breath held in the silent darkness. Finally, when the sound was gone, they crept out of their hiding places, their nerves shattered. They didn't speak, they just nodded, and moved with frantic speed back toward the elevator. They escaped into the night, the concrete core a stolen treasure that held the power to change everything. The next morning, with Lily tucked in bed, Ethan took the sample to a university lab he had contacted earlier. The head of the department, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Evans, agreed to test it, moved by the urgency in Ethan's voice. He told her everything, the cover-up, the threats, his daughter's illness. She listened, her face grim. It took 3 agonizing days for the results to come back. When they did, they were catastrophic. The concrete was nearly 40% weaker than the building code required. It wasn't just a flaw, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The building was a death trap. Dr. Evans also found another component that she had never seen before, a specific chemical marker that could only come from one of 3 very specific, non-compliant, industrial-grade suppliers. She cross-referenced it and found a match to a company known for its substandard products, a company that had been involved in a series of lawsuits overseas. The same company was listed on a shipping manifest in Ben's documents. The connection was undeniable. It was the final, irrefutable link. Armed with this evidence, Ethan contacted a reporter he trusted, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, who had broken several stories about corruption in the city. He laid out everything he had, the initial report, the humiliation in the penthouse, the emails, the stolen sample, the lab results. Sarah Jenkins was a master of her craft, and she listened with a cold fury building in her eyes. She asked Ethan why he was doing this. He looked at her, his face haggard, and said, "Because if I don't, hundreds of people could die, and I'm a father. I promised my daughter I would be brave." She nodded and told him to stay quiet and leave the rest to her. The story broke on a Thursday morning, splashed across the front page of the city's largest newspaper. The headline read in bold letters, "Sterling Tower, a death trap built on lies." The article detailed the entire conspiracy, from the corner-cutting concrete supplier to the fired manager to the silenced inspector. It included a photo of Ethan and a quote about his lone fight for the truth. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Protests erupted outside the Sterling Towers headquarters. The city council launched an emergency investigation. Julian Sterling, who had been so quick to humiliate a single father, found himself backed into a corner, his name synonymous with corporate greed and endangerment. The final showdown took place in a packed city council chamber, a public hearing that was broadcast live on every news channel in the state. Ethan was called to the stand. Julian Sterling sat at the defendant's table, surrounded by a team of expensive lawyers, his face a mask of barely concealed contempt. He was expecting to outmaneuver Ethan again, to spin his story of a disgruntled employee and a desperate inspector. The room was buzzing with tension, cameras flashing, as Ethan took his seat. The questioning was brutal. Sterling's lawyers tried to tear him apart, bringing up his financial problems, his failed marriage, his sick daughter. They called him a liar and a fraud, trying to paint him as a bitter man seeking revenge. They demanded to know why he had broken into the construction site to steal the sample. He admitted to it without flinching, his voice clear and steady. He told the room that he would break into 100 buildings if it meant saving a single life. It was at this moment that the hearing took its most shocking turn. Sarah Jenkins, the reporter, stood up from the audience and submitted new evidence that no one had seen coming. It was a sworn testimony from a woman named Linda, a former senior secretary at Sterling's company. Linda testified that she had personally typed up a memo from Julian Sterling to the concrete supplier, explicitly demanding they adjust the numbers to make the concrete appear up to code. She had kept a copy all this time, waiting for a moment like this. She had been too afraid to come forward before, but the story of Ethan's struggle had inspired her. The room gasped. The camera panned to Julian Sterling's face, and for the first time, the mask of arrogance slipped. There was panic there, a desperate, caged look. His lawyers tried to object, to have the evidence dismissed, but the council overruled them. The testimony was added to the record. The narrative had been completely destroyed. It wasn't just a cover-up by low-level staff. It was a direct order from the top. Julian Sterling, the man who had laughed at Ethan for being poor, the man who had used his daughter's illness as a weapon, was a criminal. He tried to laugh it off, to make a speech about his contributions to the city, but the words were hollow, a pathetic attempt to salvage a doomed reputation. He stood up and called Ethan a nobody, a liar who had ruined his life. Ethan met his gaze and spoke the words that would become the headline of the next day's paper. He said, "I didn't ruin your life, Mr. Sterling. You did that all on your own. I just made sure the truth caught up." The verdict wasn't just a legal one, it was a moral annihilation. The city council voted to halt all construction on the Sterling Tower, and the investigation into Julian Sterling's entire portfolio of buildings was launched. The collapse of his empire was swift and total. He was stripped of his permits, his backers abandoned him, and he was ultimately charged with fraud, reckless endangerment, and falsifying safety documents. His perfect world, built on greed and ruthlessness, crumbled into dust, just like the concrete he had used to construct it. As he was led out of the chamber in handcuffs, he looked back at Ethan one last time, his eyes filled with a hatred so pure it was almost tangible. Ethan didn't flinch. The greatest humiliation was not the handcuffs. It was the complete and total victory of the man he had tried to destroy. The aftermath was a whirlwind of change. Ben, the fired manager, was offered his job back at a new company, his integrity finally vindicated. But it was Ethan's story that captured the hearts of the city. A crowdfunding campaign was started to help him cover Lily's medical bills, a gesture of gratitude from a community that understood what he had risked. People donated not because they knew him, but because they saw in his story a reflection of their own struggles against injustice. But the money wasn't the most important part. The most important part was the vindication. He was no longer a desperate nobody. He was the man who took on a giant and won. He took Lily to the specialist the very next week. The diagnosis was serious but treatable, and the doctor was confident of a full recovery. For the first time in months, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. The final scene of the story takes place a few months later. The Sterling Tower, the monument to Julian's arrogance, now stood half-finished, a hollow ghost on the city skyline. Ethan, in a suit he had bought for the occasion, was walking through its empty halls. He wasn't there as an inspector, but as a consultant, hired by the new developers to oversee the safe demolition and rebuilding. He walked to the 42nd floor, the scene of his greatest fear and his greatest triumph. He placed his hand on the column he had drilled, the hole still there, a physical scar that told the story. His phone buzzed. It was Lily. He answered, and her voice, bright and healthy, filled the empty space. "Dad," she said, "when are you coming home? I made you dinner." He smiled, a real smile, one that didn't feel forced. "I'm on my way, honey," he said. As he walked out of the building, he looked back at its looming silhouette against the setting sun. It was a grim reminder of what happens when you value profit over people. But it was also a symbol of something else, the indomitable power of a single person, even a broke single father, to stand up and refuse to be silenced. He walked to his old truck, the same one from that fateful morning, and climbed in. Before he started the engine, he looked at the report on his passenger seat. It was the same report, the one that had caused him so much pain. Now it was framed, a testament to a battle fought and won. He had been given a choice that morning: compromise his integrity and get paid, or stand up for what was right and lose everything. He had made the right choice. He had lost his job, almost lost his daughter, but he had gained something far more valuable. He had gained his self-respect, and in doing so, he had taught his daughter a lesson more valuable than any amount of money could ever buy. He started the truck and drove home, not as a man defeated, but as a man who had faced the darkest moment of his life and emerged on the other side, whole. The story ends with a simple truth that echoes long after the final word is spoken. In a world built on ambition and lies, the only thing that can truly save you is the courage to tell the truth, no matter the cost. The building was a hollow shell, but the man who walked away from it was finally, truly, whole.